Good afternoon. My name is Declan Kelleher, and it's a great privilege for me to introduce this afternoon's very topical and very timely session on the geopolitics of climate finance. I want to, first of all, before giving the floor to the Minister for Finance, Paschal Donohoe, who's also President of the Eurogroup, just note that the Minister has returned from important meetings in Washington where the two issues of geopolitics and climate finance were top of the agenda. So I am sure that the Minister will have lots of interesting things to tell us this afternoon. And without further ado, I would invite the Minister to share with us his thoughts.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Declan. I'm absolutely delighted to be joining you all during Climate Finance Week Ireland, which is a very important milestone for our financial services sector and also for the Climate Action Roadmap for Ireland. The geopolitics of climate finance is now such a relevant topic as we see the devastating impact of climate change in Ireland, in Europe, and of course across the world. Globally, we can see that economic migration, famine, territorial conflicts, and tragically, the loss of life due to extreme weather are becoming increasingly regular events, with those least able to cope often the hardest hit. Climate change is now recognised as a key factor in global insecurity and conflict. And while the link between climate change and conflict is indirect at times and multidimensional, there are of course so many different ways in which environment and conflict meet. And this was recognised by Ireland when we championed climate and security in our successful campaign for a UN Security Council seat. So as Declan mentioned, last week the annual IMF and World Bank meetings occurred in Washington, which I had the privilege of attending. Clearly, the issues around energy security, rising inflation and economic growth, and of course, the terrible conflict and war in Ukraine were high on all of our agendas. But a common thread to all of those matters was climate, energy, and the need to transition to a lower carbon future. There was absolute agreement in all of our discussions, despite the many competing demands, on the need to amplify and on the need to prioritise climate action. We clearly need more action now. And we need to build up this action and accelerate the timelines in the transition to a low carbon economy to then achieve net zero by 2050. A prime example of how geopolitics ties into climate is the accelerated need for an energy transition, demonstrated by the energy supply dangers we are now facing in Ireland and Europe, across the world, due to the invasion by Russia of Ukraine. We clearly need to change the way we source and the way we use energy, and we need to do this urgently. Our dependence on imported natural gas must now be reduced, with the contribution of renewables to our energy supply increased significantly. This is right for security, it is right for moving to a lower carbon future. It will not only meet our important emissions reduction limits, but it manifestly makes sense from a financial perspective and also from a risk management perspective. We have made progress in this regard in Ireland, but as is often the case, there's so much more we need to do. However, through our geographical position, our position in the world, and also due to our membership of the European Union, I believe that Ireland is well placed to deal with these challenges, but also to make the most of the opportunities. As Minister for Finance of Ireland, I am particularly responsible for ensuring that our taxation system, financial regulation, and our budgetary policies are supportive of climate action within Ireland. Domestically, we have a demanding target to achieve an emissions reduction of 51% by 2020 relative to where we were in 2018, and in 2021 we placed this target on a statutory and legal basis. So those emission limits are now legally binding, and that is why we developed and are now implementing carbon budgets and sectoral emissions ceilings. Through, for example, measures such as how we remove and change our planning system for the deployment of rooftop solar panels, or the introduction of our fossil fuel divestment law, we are building the domestic legal and regulatory environment to deliver against these commitments. We've also established a statutory trajectory to increase the carbon tax to €100 per tonne by 2030. We're providing a clear signal to investors, and then price certainty to consumers, to businesses, and also to investors, but then how we invest the proceeds of higher carbon taxes back into our economy creates the resources that we need to restructure the economy itself. But our actions, even though they're important, are not taken alone. We work closely with and are influenced by international and EU action, such as the Paris Agreement and the European Green Deal. And recognising the deeply global nature of financial services, we do our best here in Ireland to be a voice for ambition at European level. We're strong supporters of the EU taxonomy for sustainable activities, which, through common science-based definitions of environmentally sustainable activities, will help to guide and scale up high-quality investment to support our net zero goals. It's also the case that for the EU budget and for the next generation EU recovery instrument, EU expenditure from 2021 to 2027 has a target of at least 30% of that spending being against climate action, with the reminder to do no harm to our climate objectives. And we do all of this inside an international environment that is responding back to the imperative of change. During COP27, climate financing will remain a central discussion item. And through our involvement in the Champions Group on adaptation finance, Ireland will continue to advocate for improving the quality and quantity of adaptation finance. We also support the ongoing dialogue within the EU Framework Convention on Climate Change and funding arrangements for loss and damage to ensure also that we bring important actors into this discussion, such as humanitarian agencies and experts on forced displacement and migration. I was also very pleased to launch the government's International Climate Finance Strategy at the IMF World Bank meetings last week, showing how the government will commit to investing €225 million each year by 2025 in the change that is needed. All of this shows that our core principles for climate finance are resolute: to prioritise support for the most vulnerable communities, including helping those affected by conflict, and also, for example, to continue to develop our relationship with the least developed states and with small island developing states, because these, after all, are those that are most exposed to climate change. And as I speak to you, Ireland's Parliament is currently debating the final stages of legislation that will enable Ireland to contribute to trust funds at the IMF to address climate vulnerability and debt sustainability that face our Caribbean colleagues. It will allow us to increase the scope of our climate financing, allow us to work with the IMF to participate in the kind of projects that are transformative, where they're most needed, and to enable us to respond to requests from the IMF for emergency funding such as grants or concessional loans. So, as a shareholder in several international institutions and multilateral development banks, such as the World Bank and the EIB, we'll use our voice alongside like-minded countries to press for action and to press for alignment with the Paris Agreement in funding and in operations. But as we do all of this, we also need the private sector to continue to accept and to continue to take on the responsibility that they need to rise to, but also to take advantage of all of the opportunities inherent in meeting our net zero drive. We need the private sector to crowd in viable climate action projects in developing countries, whether this be through the multilateral development banks, climate funds, or locally led initiatives. Governments have set the requirements. We are doing our bit. We've made the first steps. And many of you who are here today are from companies, from banks, from sectors of industry and our economy that have made public pledges to reduce carbon emissions or to increase financing for sustainable projects. I ask you today to deliver on those pledges. And this is because climate change is a global challenge. And to counteract it, we cannot act alone. We have common, albeit different, responsibilities. Governments must walk the tightrope between taking the right action domestically and cooperating regionally and internationally so we can have the best chance of success. The Paris Agreement guides us all. And this is why the COP27 meetings taking place in a few weeks' time in Egypt will continue to be so important. Through high-level dialogue, through negotiation that will take place there, it provides a further opportunity to consider these issues, to consider the geopolitics of climate finance, and to agree how we move forward. We'll continue to play our part domestically in Europe and across the world to ensure that we are influencing, that we are driving positive action on climate. It's not easy. Indeed, at times, it's very demanding, but we'll play our part in the work ahead. Finance may only be one part of this work, but it is a crucial part. And this is why this week has been an important milestone in delivering on our climate finance objectives. I hope and I believe that the discussions taking place can deliver real results. But it is up to all of us to make those results a reality and to play our part in building a different and better future. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, for that very comprehensive and very inspiring outlook on the issues that arise at national, EU and global level. You have given us much food for thought and you have set out a very, very high level of ambition, and we thank you very much for that. May I now introduce Marcie Frost, who is Chief Executive Officer of CalPERS, or to give it its full name, the California Public Employment Retirement System. Marcie is CEO of an extraordinarily powerful organization. CalPERS has nearly $500 billion in assets under management, if I'm not mistaken. CalPERS was founded 90 years ago, and CalPERS has been consistently a forward-looking and ambitious investor. And CalPERS has adopted and embraced very fully ESG, environmental, social, and governmental questions. So I look forward very much to hearing what Marcie has to say, and after that, we'll have a discussion. So Marcie, could you please share your thoughts with all of us? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you for allowing me to speak with you today and for the very generous award you presented me last evening. As I said at that event, the award is really a recognition for everyone who works on behalf of the 2 million members of our pension fund. And I'm honored to share with you today a little of the climate journey we have embarked on at CalPERS. Like millions of visitors to Ireland, I've quickly found myself enchanted by the famed Emerald Isle. The natural beauty on these shores has inspired generations of poets, artists, and musicians. But for those of us from California, Ireland's lush landscape offers a heartbreaking reminder of our Golden State. Perhaps some of you remember the dreamy surfing movie of the 1960s about California, the one called The Endless Summer. Well, this year we had the worst kind of endless summer. Many of California's world-famous views have been left brown and withered after a history-making drought, and a long streak of unrelenting, record-breaking heat waves. We are still reeling from a deadly and devastating wildfire season. And if that wasn't enough, Southern California experienced a hurricane just last month. Even the promise of much-needed rain this winter has a downside these days, as it raises the danger of mudslides from the charred and dried terrain. California has long embraced its reputation of what our governor calls America's coming attraction. But these days, we are a warning sign for the world. Simply put, California's 40 million residents have a front row seat to the growing threat posed by climate disruption. The lives of our CalPERS members and their families are on the line. And more than ever, we must be leaders in the race to address climate change. CalPERS is a long-term investor, but we cannot focus on the future without taking action to protect the future. Our pension fund has embraced 4 distinct climate-focused strategies, and each one is a vital part of our fight to address this crisis. First, we use our voice. CalPERS is the largest public employee pension fund in the United States. We do seek to educate and influence government and industry leaders across the world to take what we call decisive and far-reaching actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Next, as we say in the States, we put our money where our mouth is. We use active engagement to ensure the companies in which we invest are themselves invested in climate-friendly practices. And we use our voice to demand that companies disclose how climate disruptions will affect their business operations. As influential investors, we are not shy about telling corporate managers and boards of directors what we want to see. We stand up for transparency, both as investors and as stewards of our pension fund. We expect a return on the risk that we take, and so we vote the shares we own with an eye toward low-carbon policies and practices. Third, we mean what we say, or more simply, we have to walk that walk. We are always on the lookout for the right kinds of investments in the ever-growing low-carbon economy. We take steps to mitigate the risks to our portfolio from investment where values could erode as the result of climate disruptions around the world. And then finally, we leverage our relationships. We rely on our friends and partners to help us create change. Many of those allies are in the audience today. Now, none of this is easy. Often it does seem harder than we probably ever imagined. But the work is getting done. Like so many of our strategies, the CalPERS effort on climate change is diversified. We're not naive, and we know there are no easy solutions to this crisis. So let me share a few examples of what we've been doing. We've reduced the carbon intensity of our global equity portfolio by more than 30% over the past 7 years. And we've done even more when it comes to our global fixed income corporate portfolio, cutting the carbon intensity by 51%. We have fully measured the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions of CalPERS' extensive real estate portfolio. And we have identified ways to reduce real estate portfolio's annual energy consumption by some 53 million kilowatt hours. Now, more than ever, we invest with an eye toward climate-friendly opportunities. We have sizable assets in companies known for their low-carbon solutions. More than 1/3 of our real assets have sustainability certifications. And more than half of CalPERS' infrastructure assets are focused on areas such as renewable energy and energy efficiency, or are assets that are carbon neutral. These are accomplishments that we are quite proud of, and yet we haven't achieved enough. There's so much more we need to do. In 2019, we joined the United Nations Asset Owner Alliance, an effort to focus on a net zero approach. This effort was designed for investors to decarbonize their investment portfolios with an eye toward limiting the rise in global temperatures. We've had success in constraining the implied temperature rise related to our global equity portfolio. But again, make no mistake, we have to do more. We are actively working with the many powerful partners represented in Climate Action 100+, the investor initiative CalPERS helped to create, now representing some $68 trillion in assets. And then last year, we co-founded an effort to improve the reporting of data related to greenhouse gases and renewable energy when it comes to assets held in private equity. The effort has already attracted support from general partners and limited partners who represent some 2,000 companies. And I want to pause briefly to focus on this private equity strategy, because it's part of CalPERS' commitment to investing through the lens of ESG, environmental, social, and government risks as well as opportunities. We believe an ESG approach is a key part of sustainable investing. Last year, CalPERS was proud to work alongside Carlyle, a GP, Blackstone, a GP, and others to help standardize ESG reporting for companies in our respective private equity portfolios. Simply put, doing the right thing is good for business, and it is good for investors. And we reject the distortions and the untruths about ESG principles being made by those who seek only to advance their own political agendas. We believe in clarity and transparency, and we believe that as large shareholders across an array of investments, our seat at the table gives California's pension fund a voice that cannot be ignored. That's why we've worked hard with U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission on new climate disclosure rules. And the voice of CalPERS was certainly heard last year during director elections at Exxon. It's also being heard at Chevron, an oil company whose roots are homegrown on the Pacific coast of the United States. But none of this can take place if we simply walk away. Some believe that when it comes to environmental protection, the only way to be on the right side of history is to divest from those challenging sectors, to just cash out and hope others in the global marketplace will lead those sectors to address climate change. We respectfully disagree. The stakes are too high. It's not time to do less. It's time to do more. It's not time to walk away. It's really time to roll up your sleeves and fight the good fight. We spend a lot of time talking about risk when it comes to evaluating our investments, but the threat to all of us from a rapidly warming planet and climate disruption, that's a risk unlike any other. CalPERS is celebrating its 90th anniversary this year. Our story began with a group of California leaders who, in the wake of the Great Depression, were filled with optimism about the future, about learning from our past. All these years later, we still embrace that optimism. We do believe that our investments make a difference. a difference in the lives of millions of women and men who answer the call to public service, a difference in the collective health of California families through our role in shaping healthcare policy, and a difference when we can leverage our members' collective assets to prioritize the common good and secure a better future. We are eager to be your partner here in Europe and across the globe to use our collective voices to do what's right. There's no time to waste. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcie, for that very rich and very inspiring overview. And I'd just like to remind everybody that actually Marcie's family is from here in Ireland. Her family originated in Kilkenny, and I think you can see Marcie as one of the very greatest Irish-American success stories. So we're delighted to have you here, Marcie, and delighted you can spare the time to have a bit of a discussion now. I also should say that you're a regular visitor to Ireland, so you know Ireland very well. Again, it's a great privilege to be with you today. Marcie, let me go back to the point that the Minister and you touched on, the challenge of geopolitics. We've had a pandemic, we've had a war in Europe, we have increasingly difficult relations between the US and China. We also, I think, should remember here in Ireland, and you said it in your speech, that California is essentially a Pacific entity. It's on the Pacific coast of the US. And well, you didn't say it in the speech, but I think it's an interesting point that were California an independent state, it would be the 5th largest economy in the world, bigger than France, India, UK, Italy, and Korea. So I think geopolitics is something of importance to us all, but I think particularly, if I may say so, from your perspective, CalPERS. And the minister, as he said, was in Washington last week. The head of the IMF said something there, Kristalina Georgieva. She said something, I think, very important, that despite the geopolitics, we have to remember that there is no pause button on climate change. So could you share with us your thoughts about how to work through those dilemmas, those challenges, how to keep the focus on effectively moving forward on good climate finance despite these geopolitical problems that are there? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, so certainly the United States and the geopolitical risks of running a portfolio in the United States when you have an ESG focus have become even more real of recent. But I think, for CalPERS, in the context of how we invest the assets on the behalf of our members, we are return seeking, but we also have to be really careful about looking at long-term risks. The investment decisions that we are making today have to withstand various environmental and market cycles over decades to come. And so what we tend to do is we engage with the companies, we engage with policyholders, we talk about the importance of the E, S, and the G, and sometimes the S and the G get lost with the E on the climate side. But we believe that all three, the human capital practices of a company, the governance structure of those companies, those are all highly correlated to the long-term success in the business model of the companies that we're investing in. So I spend a lot of time talking to politicians. I spend a lot of time explaining why CalPERS is looking at this, E, S, and G through both the risk and the return lens. And trying to keep politics out of our portfolio is probably the toughest job I have day to day.
Well, thanks, Marcie. And if I could take that up a bit, I mean, California traditionally has an enlightened view. Your government and your legislature in California, CalPERS has an enlightened and forward-looking view. But there are states in the US who have taken a different approach, who have a kind of pro-fossil fuel, indeed litigiously pro-fossil fuel approach. I'm thinking of Texas and Florida in particular. So how do you work through that? Because obviously investors are going to be affected, and there is a list, I think, of 9 investors who have been, if you like, listed by one or both of those states. So how do you work around that problem?
So we have a lot of discipline in the way that we invest the assets, and we certainly have investments in some of those states who have taken a very different position on ESG or fossil fuels or energy companies than certainly a CalPERS would. But it's not a binary issue. It's not we can't invest here or we should invest there. We really are, again, looking at that longer term risk and return opportunity. But there are politics at work and at play here that don't necessarily take into account that these pension funds, including pension funds that operate out of Florida and Texas, are there solely to provide a benefit to the pensioners of that system. And so you might use ESG as a reason to divest from assets, which is a lot of the discussion that's happening in the United States right now. And we just reject that viewpoint. But even in California, there is some sense of urgency coming out of our own politicians around, we need to do this faster. We've made a commitment to be net zero by 2050, but absent a plan, others want to create a faster paced plan than maybe what CalPERS has done. Our position really has been to engage, get the regulatory environment set up to where we can transparently see how companies are managing this transition. If companies are not managing the transition within a risk-aware manner or a manner in which we think that company will be sustainable over the market cycles, then that might be an opportunity that we move those assets away from that particular company. But to simply have a general policy that we're going to divest, that doesn't make sense for a CalPERS. To me, it doesn't make sense for a California, who really, when you think about the demographics of that state, are really interested in having a just transition, that we're not leaving anyone behind. And that's really been our belief, and I think we can add a lot of value there.
You mentioned a just transition, and that's also the view in the European Union. They phrase it slightly differently, but it's the same concept. But what's your view on the argument you often hear that, yes, we want to get to net zero, yes, we have these ambitions, but it has to be done gradually. And that, for example, is the Chinese view that Xi Jinping said at the Party Congress just a few days ago, that yes, they have the ambitions, but it has to be done in a gradual way, which tends to translate as possibly being the slowest boat in the convoy. How do you see that?
Well, I think, so we've made a commitment by 2050, but I think fundamentally we believe that 2050 is too long of a time horizon. And so sometimes, even in our discussions with companies, especially as the United States, the SEC has formulated their regulations, those are out for public comment, and you get the issuer, point of view, and you get the investor point of view. And the issuers are saying the same thing, that we should have a just transition, a slow transition. But sometimes slow will get in the way of getting anything done. It almost becomes an excuse to do nothing, that we're in a certain market cycle, so all of our attention needs to be focused on how do we save this particular company. But what we're telling everyone who we're speaking with through our corporate engagement is that this is an and, it's not an or. If you're not looking at your company's sustainability practices, or even the fact that you may not be in business 10 years, 20 years, or by 2050, if you do not look at all of the factors related to ESG. So we reject that notion a bit. Sometimes I think that is used as an excuse to do nothing.
The United States is going through some developments of policy at the moment. The Biden administration is setting out new policies on national security, on trade policy, and on industrial policy. And while it's early days, certainly if you look at what Catherine Tai said recently, and also Jake Sullivan at Georgetown, I think a week or so ago, there's a move away from, if you like, traditional free trade agreements. And there's a move towards something which is geared essentially to defend, I think, against Chinese policies. But what it does entail possibly is, the danger of duplication. You have a globalized, just-in-time supply chain. Supply chains are becoming increasingly fragile. You now have something that's being called the weaponization of interdependence. So the risk for that, for climate change, must be considerable in the sense that, if you make it once, you have a certain effect on the climate. You make it twice, the effect is double, and the negative effects are double. How do you see that? And do you see that as something you're going to have to deal with strategically?
Well, we're always thinking about the next macroeconomic cycle that may be hitting our portfolio. And supply chain issues, I think we all felt those personally during the COVID pandemic, and still ongoing in parts of the world. But I think that the industrial section or just the the replication of certain types of goods and services, consumer demand and consumers getting getting their own households into shape. For me, I did a net zero review of my own household, and so it really has curbed some of the things that I have done. But I think the consumer voice is really missing. There's a high appetite for goods and services, certainly in the United States, other parts of the world, and I think countries are grappling with that. The United States wants a little more independence. They saw those supply chain disruptions, particularly in the healthcare and the medical supply industry, and taking back control of some of that and not allowing it to be weaponized. I think those policy discussions and effectively what will eventually happen, I'm not sure, but I think those policy discussions about free trade or a consistent supply chain, that's going to be center for the United States for a while.
In your remarks, you referred to ESG, and you made the point that sometimes people tend to forget about the S and the G. Mm-hmm. But does that raise the question of whether the concept of ESG is coherent? Mm-hmm. Because if you look at the environment, that's existential, that's the planet, that's dinosaurs, that's something where the clock is ticking. Mm-hmm. Social and governance are very important, particularly the human rights and the ancillary supportive aspects of that. But do you think ESG as a concept is the right one, mm-hmm. or does it need to be broken down? And does it run the risk of being turned into, if you like, a virtuous slogan? Mm-hmm.
Well, we do need a common language. It's a common problem for the globe. It's not just a problem in California, a problem in the United States. So we do need a common language to create a common action plan, for all countries to participate in. But I do believe that there is weighting to the E, S, and the G. And frankly, for CalPERS, what we found in some of our interactions on the government side is that we just stopped calling it ESG because it does lack a little bit of the finance side, the fiduciary side, certainly the responsibilities we have. But I think climate needs to be its own. It needs to be carved out, and we'll come up with a different language for that. But equally, maybe not as equally important, but the human capital side of this is how are you going to transition the workers into a lower carbon economy? That resistance, if not handled well, will slow this down to a point where we were talking about being the slowest boat. We've got to bring the consumers along. So there has to be something in it. There have to be incentives that get consumers to look at how they purchase or how they support a particular company. And then on the governance side, it's really about having the expertise on the boards and that the boards are paying attention to climate. So I think those two, the E and the G, go more in hand than the S. But I think a carve out is likely necessary because the ESG word itself, or the acronym, has really become a political football in the United States.
Yeah. And I think that's also something which in the European Union, I think there's a high awareness of, and that's why you have a very substantial throughput of regulation recently in the EU. Some have been very difficult. For example, the taxonomy regulation that the minister referred to, different views among member states whether nuclear should be involved. But also there is a need, and the EU, I think, sees this for, if you like, independent agreed standards. And there are some recent bits of regulation and corporate sustainability reporting in the financial area which do kind of create mechanisms for independent auditing. Mm-hmm. And that, it seems to me, as a layman, would be something of great interest to CalPERS because mm-hmm. it makes it easier to take investment decisions. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If a company is either above the bar or below the bar, or there's a question mark about it. Mm-hmm. I'd be interested in your own sense in that, and whether you see any scope for kind of transatlantic cooperation on that. I know there are different views on certain things like border adjustment mechanisms, but we leave that to one side. Mm-hmm. But do you see scope for further cooperation between the EU and the US and the EU and California on this? Mm-hmm.
I do. I think more standardized reporting. If we want to bring the issuers along with us and have more this representative view between an investor and an issuer, we do need to bring them along a bit. But today, investors like CalPERS, we're making a lot of assumptions about the risks that we have in the portfolio, and the ISSB, the SEC are all considering, how do you not just furnish this data that we need, I like your point about auditing, independent auditors coming in to verify that data. But there has to be some mechanism where it's verifiable data that an investor can use to make our decisions that have to withstand long-term scrutiny. So I think there are opportunities for us to cooperate more and create a standardized framework, as well as this consistent effort of moving forward.
COP27 is coming up soon, and the COPs are kind of both absolutely essential, but also strange animals in the question of how you break down the relative weight of stakeholders, given the fact that it's not just an intergovernmental kind of process. Are you optimistic about the COP27 in Egypt that's coming up soon? I mean, what would you like to see out of it, and what would be good from your perspective as CEO of CalPERS?
Well, I think what we have found out of even COP26 were very strong commitments made to take action. Action that's supported by commitments in dollars to go into certain strategies or certain sectors to really help move this transition. But we need to move away from commitments to action, and I'm hoping that comes out of COP27, that we get more shared actions that can be taken that have metrics and measurements to know whether we're improving, are we getting worse, are we about staying the same. But I think it's a good time to network with your peers who have common interests, create that common language. But really, again, it's about, we can talk a lot about this topic, but the talking is not making, really having the effect of what real action would mean.
I see we're very close up against the time deadline, but let me ask you just one final question. The pandemic and the effect of the war in Ukraine and the aggression by Russia has brought the United States and the EU closer together. But below that, you can see a few problems. I mean, the European Commission has responded with not great happiness to the new Biden Inflation Reduction Act, and particularly what the Commission sees as protectionist approaches on electric vehicles in the US. And the US is quite unhappy with the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is basically a tariff or a tax the EU wants to impose. Obviously, you and your colleagues in CalPERS take a close interest in that and want to see that work out in a harmonious and positive way. Where do you see the big problems, the big potential dangers that could arise, despite the convergence between the EU and the US after the Ukraine war, because of the Ukraine war, but because of this tendency to, kind of weaponization of interdependence? Where do you see the the things that we should be looking out for?
Well, the Biden administration has done a lot of great things for the investor community like CalPERS. But we also have to understand that CalPERS is a global investor. We don't just invest in the United States. So we have a vested interest in the relationship between the US and the EU being positive. I don't tend to weigh in too much on the federal policies unless they have a direct negative impact on CalPERS. But EV vehicles, California has made a commitment. Governor Newsom has said no new gas-powered vehicles, automobiles, starting in 2035. But we don't have the infrastructure to fully implement that, right? So charging stations and battery life. And so I think we have to have cooperation. Geopolitics are going to continue to be one of the primary risks that we see ahead of us. But we can't have politics playing into a real strong alliance like we have with the EU. So I think energy. I think carbon tax, carbon pricing. We're very supportive of that. The U.S. would have to pass that through Congress. That's going to be a very, very difficult path. We continue to push on that as an area that certainly our delegate from California, our delegates certainly support us there, but I don't see that happening in the U.S. So that could always be a bit of a bump in the relationship. But it's really around energy transition, and we need the United States to take a stronger lead than what I'm personally seeing today.
Okay, Marcie, look, thank you. happily continue this for another hour, but we're out of time, unfortunately. So I just want to thank you very much for sharing your views with us today. I'd also like to add my own congratulations to the honour you received yesterday evening, and to say that having served twice myself in the United States, it's fantastic that we have such a distinguished Irish-American female CEO here with us today. So congratulations, Marcie, and every success for the future.
Thank you.